with 2 slides, okay, which is the history basically. So if you open it, you will see that it starts from ancient Greece, ancient Greek music, because in Western music, so when we think about Western music, you think also about the music that we listen to today, which includes rock and rap and hip hop and all kinds of music. Rap and rock comes from obviously from blues, rhythm blues, then from jazz, and then jazz comes from classical music, and classical music can be dated back to 2,000 years ago. Okay, so music in ancient Greece. So that's the first topic, because we tend to trace back the origin of our music, so our music of Western culture, back to the ancient Greek and ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Okay, this is just a picture of a geographical area where Greece is. You should know this. Generally speaking, the Greeks are famous for different things: democracy and Greek drama, which is theater, philosophy, very famous philosophers such as Socrates and Plato, the Olympics, and all these kind of things. But what about music? Because this class is about music. So what do we know about music in Greek society? We know a little bit. We don't know that much because a lot of the manuscripts and the fragments are lost, are gone. We are talking about something that occurred more than 2,000 years ago. So we know, for example, that music in Greek society was performed, or could be performed by one person, so a solo singer, by a choir, by a person with musical instruments. We also know that it was performed during ceremonies, weddings, funerals, and so on. We know a little bit about the instruments that they use, because not so much because we actually have the physical instruments. We do have some, very few, but because we have a lot of images, depicted. I mean, actually not a lot, but we have some images that depict and show the instruments that they used. Okay, those 3. I won't ask you this, but it's important. This is just a picture of the instruments that the Greeks and the Romans used, in case you're curious to see how they looked like. Okay. We know that music actually play a very important role in theater. In fact, we do have a couple of fragments with music for the theater, for theatrical music. We know they play a very important, it was a very important aspect of their musical, of their ideas of music. So, and in fact, this idea was actually very influential because it was, it went on until the Baroque period, so it was very, very important. This is one of the fragments that have survived, which is called Oreste, the one here I'm showing right now, and it dates about 400 years before Christ, so before the year 0. You can actually listen to it here with the link. Because we are doing recorded videos, I won't play it, otherwise it would be very complicated to go back to the video again. But I will try to play some of them, but you can listen to it. And of course, you will see which videos are important, which music is important, because eventually they will be in the quizzes. And when I'll talk about the selections for the quizzes, you will know clearly. We know that there was something very important that you have to be, which will be in the exam, which is this here, the scholion. What is a scholion? The scholion for the Greeks was basically a song. So it was a poem which was set to music, right? Like you can imagine, like today when we have a rap song or a rock song or a pop song, where you have the text, lyrics, and you set these lyrics to music. That's the same thing for them at that time. So it was a Greek poem which was set to music. And usually this kind of scholion, these songs were performed during some symposium. So the symposium were like gatherings of people, which included conversation, discussion, music, dances, and so on. That's an example of a scholion. Here there's a YouTube link here. You can listen to it if you want. And actually, I will try to play this, and let's see if he allows me to.
Okay, so it turns out not all laptops are created equal.
Here we go. Of course, here the music is very rudimental. It sounds very different from the music that we are listening to today. This music is so different from our music. In this, but you have to understand that actually our music, goes back to a long time ago. And we in this class you will see that that's what we are going to investigate. So how we got to the music that we listen to today, right? Um, so I'm gonna go back to the slides because I was in the YouTube video. So what happened here is that music was very important for the Greeks. In fact, a lot of Greek philosophers conferred a lot of importance to music. Some of them believed that music could change human behavior. Okay, so they consider music the most important among all the arts. This is another question that will be in the exam, and when I'll do the exam review, you'll see it. Actually, if you look at the rubric for exam 1, it's already in there, so you can't really go wrong. And I explained that in the first video, that everything that is underlined will be in the exam like this. So that's important. What is the greater perfect system? So if you first of all, you have to know what an octave is. So an octave is 8 notes. So it's the distance between one note and the other note, right? And there are 8 notes, okay? So if you count, there are 8 notes. So if you say you have 2 octaves, obviously you have 16 notes, because 8 plus 8 is 16. So the greater perfect system, according to the Greeks, was made of 16 notes, so 2 octaves, scales, which basically could also be thought as 4 tetrachords. Okay, what is a tetrachord? A tetrachord is 4 notes. So question, how many tetrachords do you need to come up with 60 notes? Well, 4, because 4 by 4 multiplied by 4 is 16. That's what it is. Now we get to a very important time, which is the ancient Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages. So Rome, of course, you heard a lot about the Roman Empire, very famous, right? But when it comes to music, the Romans were very powerful from the point of view of engineering and from military point of view. But when it came to art, the Romans really emulated, copies a lot the Greeks. Okay. In fact, we have no examples of ancient Roman music, but we do have more than 50 examples of Greek music, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, we also know that the Roman used the same musical instruments of the Greeks, right? But they also have a new one, which was the tuba. The tuba was like, the tuba was like a kind of trumpet, which we know was used in battles, during battles. And then you have this famous guy. His name was Marcianus Capella. He was the first to kind of made a very strange distinctions between the arts. So we talk about trivium, the liberal arts, which were of 2 kinds. So the trivium, which included grammar, logic, and oratory, and then you had the quadrivium, right, which included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and of course music, because music was really highly regarded at that time. Then this guy here, his name was Boethius. He came up that he thought that there were 3 kinds of music. So there was a musica called mondana, which is music of the sphere, so real music. Musica umana, which is music of the human body, and then musica instrumentale, which is earthly music, so musically performed by voices or instruments. Okay, these were very philosophical ideas, very abstract ideas of music. Okay. Finally, something important happened. So we know that Jerusalem was a very important center for music at that time, and we know that chant developed, and we know that music was performed in early Christian churches and synagogues, and we know that music was monophonic, and that's a very important term that you have to know. Monophonic means only one melody, so it doesn't matter how many people are singing. There can be 1, there can be 2, there can be 100, but there's still only one person, there's still only one melody, okay? Which is different from polyphony, which I'll talk about later. We also know that in Christian and early synagogue, Christian church and early synagogues, there were a cantor. A cantor was a person in charge of the organization of the singing, of the music. So in the synagogues, the problem is that we do not actually have the music because it's gone. It has not survived at all. So we have nothing left. We know a little bit about music in synagogues thanks to the Bible, to the Jewish Torah. That's all we know. And then we get to a very important topic, which is notation. Okay, so this is like so important for us. This is like if I ask you, when did humans begin to read and write? So when did humans begin to write down musical notation? So the first examples of musical notation that we have dates around the 9th century, so around 900 after Christ. Those notations, however, this type of notation, however, was very primitive, was very rudimental. It was not like the one we use today. Eventually, there was a development which led to the notes we use today. These were called neumes or neumes. So the neumes were actually signs which were placed above the text. So were like symbols, signs that indicated only the approximate direction of the melody, not specific pitch, not the specific height of each note or the rhythm. And there were two types of neumes, of notation. There were chironomic notation and diastematic notation. So the difference is very simple. That chironomic has no lines in the manuscript, while diastematic has one or more lines. And it's very simple. Look at this. These are the manuscripts, these are manuscripts that I worked on in the past. And that's an example of chironomic notation, because you can see that those signs here, right? There are some signs here. Here you can see on the text, there are no lines. So it's more difficult to see which note is higher and which note is lower. Here, on the other hand, and that's an example of diastematic notation, you see some lines or horizontal lines, which basically tells you, hey, this note is higher than this other note because there's a line, it's above the line or it's below the line. It's very simple. And there were a lot of types of chants at the time. There was not just one type of chant. Okay, because if you went to different parts of Europe, you would find different chants. You don't have to know this list. There's no need to know all of it, but it is just for you to understand that the different kind of song, different kind of religious chants exist at that time. And you should play one. If you can play one. Let's play this one, for instance. So at least you understand how a chant sounds like. So there, of course, you can listen to other examples. I included the link here, okay, if you want. Now, there was the kind of medieval music also had, there was also kind of a theory behind medieval music and behind notation. I'm going to skip this for a second. I'm going to come back to this later. So this kind of music was largely performed in monasteries or churches. So monks were those who copied down the manuscript and disseminated the music eventually. So they're very important. This is just for music, but because monks also copied scientific treatises and philosophical treatises. So they were very, very instrumental in the dissemination, in the development of our culture eventually. So they divided chants, so the songs, in 8 groups of scales of modes. So a scale is like when you say do, si, when you sing 8 notes in a series, that's a scale, right? And so they had 8 groups of scales. By the 12th century, we start to see a very clear evolution in the notation. We see clear lines, 4 lines, like in this manuscript here. We're in the 13th century, and we are much closer to what we are used to today. You can see there are 4 lines, and the notes are squared, and they're placed either on the line or between the lines, as you can see here. So it's kind of easier to tell which note is high and which is higher, which note is lower. Okay, so there is an evolution, obviously. So we are already in the 13th century, which is 1300, so 700 years ago, roughly. And this guy here was very important. His name was Guido of Arezzo because he was a monk, was a very knowledgeable monk who was the first who introduced two important innovations in music. The first innovation was the musical stuff with the name of the notes, which we still use today, And the second innovation, and he did that in one of his treatises, which is called Micrologos. But the second innovation was a little bit more strange. It was basically a musical hand. So it was a musical hand that was used, it was conceived for the singers to memorize the distance between the notes. Okay, and it's this one here, is next slide. So I mentioned earlier there is a lot of material which just pictures. Okay. This also will be in the exam, so you have to know this because I will ask you this in the exam. In fact, as you can see, is underlined, so you cannot miss it. This is the Guidonian hand. So European monasteries in Europe are very, very, very important for everything. Okay, not just for music. This is just an example I included. I'm just going to skip this slide here because it's not important. But for instance, the monastery of St. Gall was very famous in Switzerland. A lot of manuscripts were copied there, including a musical manuscript. But it was not the only monastery at that time. There were monasteries that were equally important. Okay, and this is just a picture of how a monastery will look like. So you have a church, you have a cloister for wine, a refectory, right, dormitory, a scriptorium, and a library. Okay. These you have to know. So this will also be in the exam. As you can see, is underlined and bold. Syllabic versus melismatic. So these are just two ways of describing a melody, even today. Okay, so if I ask you what this song, it sounds very syllabic, or this part of the song sounds very melismatic, what does it mean? It means that syllabic, one note per syllable, and melismatic, you have many notes per syllable. So if I sing, for instance, if I sing the word, I don't know, any words that you would want, let's say important, right? If I sing it important, that's syllabic, right? Because there is one note per syllable. And if I sing it important, that's not syllabic, it's melismatic because I sang many notes on a single syllable, right? That's the difference. So it's very straightforward. It's not just about chant, it's about even today's music. Then there was another term that you have to know for the purpose of the exam, which is antiphonal. What does it mean? So antiphonal here, sorry, let me try to highlight this. Here we go. Antiphonal means when you have two groups alternating. So you have two choirs alternating. So they sing in alternation. So literally would be, the definition would be alternating groups singing. Okay. And this lady here, very important, Hildegard of Bingen. She was a woman, very, very knowledgeable woman, very important composer too. She wrote a lot of chants and also tropes. So a trope is a chant, but trope is an addition of music or text to a pre-existing chant, right? Sometimes because you don't have enough words in a chant, in a song, so you add words to it. That's called a trope. It's kind of a process. It's the addition of music or text. And Bingen, she wrote a lot of chants, one of which is this Dies Irae, which you should listen. This is just an example, it won't be an exam, but you should listen to this piece if you can, okay, if you have time. The question I will ask in the exam actually is, where are all her chants preserved? So she wrote a lot of chants, and most of her chants are preserved in this manuscript, which is called Symphonia, okay? So that's the title of the manuscript. And I use the word manuscript because they did not have book at that time yet. We're talking about 1,000 years ago. Okay, so there was no such thing as a book yet. Printing was invented much later, as I will talk about later in a different video. That's an example. Okay. So yes, so that's one example of a chant by Hildegard of Bingen. Okay, and I will play this example actually. As you can see, this manuscript is diastematic because it has notation. So yes, it's diastematic because he has lines, right? Do you see the lines? Okay, so so that was Hildegard of Bingen, very important figure in the history of medieval music. Let me this again. Okay. 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 So we're already around the year 1000. So we're talking about very important evolution. So talk about polyphony. I talk about monophony, which is the opposite of polyphony. So monophonic means only one melody. Doesn't matter how many people are singing. It's only one melody. Polyphony is the opposite. So polyphony is two or more melodies at the same time. So things get a little bit more complicated now, because polyphony, as I wrote down here, is the simultaneous sounding or two or more independent musical lines. So this is really the beginning of our music, of Western music, because it's when we talk about chords. I don't know if you ever heard about chords. When someone, a friend of yours who plays the guitar or a piano and plays the chords, that's what it means. It's polyphony because you play two or three notes at the same time. Okay. The first, actually at that time, the way they call it was not called polyphony. It was called organum. That was the name for polyphony that they used. Polyphony is a modern term. Okay. The first theoretical description of polyphony, so the first source that talks about people singing altogether two or more melodies at the same time, is this Musica in Kyriatis, which is a treatise. It's a manuscript that talks about organum, talks about polyphony. But the first practical, an organum was basically you had a voice, and then, which is the principal voice, right? And then you have the voice that added to the principal voice, which is called organal voice. So you have two voices: the first one, which already existed, and then a new one on top of that voice, which is called the organal voice, and that create two melodies at the same time. Now, the first example of the first practical source of polyphony was the Winchester trope, and I said was and not is because there is a recent discovery actually, and there is an article here below which I included. You should read it if you can, which discusses a new discovery, so a new discovery of polyphony. So, but anyway, one of the first practical source of polyphony is the Winchester trope. And the difference between theoretical source and practical source is that the theoretical source talks about it, right? While a practical source is actually the music, so it actually did composition. Another important question I will ask in the exam, which is underlined in bold, is something about this manuscript. What is this manuscript? That's called the Codex Calixtinus. The Calixtinus Code. The Calixtinus Code is why is important? Because it's the first example, so it's the first manuscript that ascribe the composers' names to particular pieces. So until now, until the 12th century, music was anonymous. Anonymous means that we do not know who composed the music, because music was performed in church, so there was no copyright material, right? So there was no need to credit anyone either, because music was functional. So this is the first manuscript that gives us the name of the composers now. So that's very interesting. And it's called Codex Calixtinus. And this is a picture of the manuscript. This is an example. You can see here on the top right, you can see the name of the composers, even though it's not clearly legible, but his name was a Master Albertus of Paris, apparently, because he came from Paris. That's the example of the music. If you want to listen to it on YouTube, it's right here, so it's interesting if you never listened to this before. And then finally, we talk about a little bit secular music. So by the 13th century, now we have the first examples of secular music. That's very important because now music is not just religious, it's also secular. So secular means non-religious. So now we have people writing love songs and songs about love between a man and a woman, not just God, and also songs about in general, so secular songs. These were actually called the troubadours and the trouvères. So these were French poets, musicians. So they were both poets because they wrote the poems, and they were also musicians because they wrote the music too. So they wrote the lyrics, basically, what we call today the lyrics of the songs, and they also wrote the music for the songs. And they traveled around from one court to another court. So most of them actually were nobles, were rich, because and and the other important aspect is that now we have the secular music right now because these were able to write it down. But it doesn't mean that before the 13th century there was no secular music. It's just that it was not written down and it was passed down orally. Okay. And Bernarda Bertoldo was very important because it was a person who wrote many of these secular songs. One of which is actually in the quiz too, and I'll play it. Is this one here? So that's one of the earliest example of a secular song, non-religious song. Here we go. So there were also other types of secular music in other parts of Europe, including Germany. And these musicians in Germany these poets, musicians in Germany were called Minnesingers. And of course, they were singing in German, not in French. And also in Spain and in Italy, there were other kinds of secular songs now, which are recorded in writing. So now we have it. And we are around the 13th century. Okay, so that's very important. So now in the 13th century, we do have examples of secular songs or secular music, not just religious. So, okay, we're going as you can see, we go pretty fast because, it's obviously we have to cover 2,000 years of music. We have to talk about, eventually at the end of the semester, we will talk about rock, before actually the semester, rock and rap. So we're going pretty fast. This is just for you to understand how music evolved, okay, how we got to the music that we listen to today, okay. And now you see some examples of things that sounds closer to what we are used to, even though we are kind of far away because today we listen to different kinds of music. But you have to appreciate this because our music, so the music that we listen to today, comes from here, okay. Doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from here. It comes back 500 years or 1,000 years back. Okay, so I will stop here and I will see you in next video.